Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. Today, we are talking about the science of reading and teacher prep. Woo! Let's keep talking about it.
Yes. Until the right person hears us. I don't know who that is, but someone.
The president.
So important. Yes, President Biden. I don't know if I'll do anything about this. But maybe
somebody needs to hear it. Mm-hmm. So in a few minutes, we will roll the podcast with Hannah Putman. She wrote a piece that caught our attention, getting districts and teacher prep on the same page on reading. Oh, preach.
It pays off.
Yeah, it pays off. And it's based on research from, is it Calder? Do you know, is it Calder?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I'm not going to pretend I know that one.
Yep. But anyway, it's based on some great research that we do share both in the podcast as well as in the show notes. And Hannah also shares a resource from NCTQ and National Council on Teacher Quality, and shares action guides that are really usable and accessible. So we share those as well.
Very cool.
Yeah, Melissa, I know you have some thoughts on this.
Chat for a few minutes. I do have some thoughts, and I wasn't able to make it to Hannah's interview, so I made Lori chat with me for a little bit so that I could share my thoughts too. But there were a couple articles that came out recently that just I'm like, oh yeah, this is actually, I don't even think they came out recently. I just came across them recently. Mm-hmm. One of them is an article from Edweek that is, the science of reading, catch on, and teacher prep, which I think is actually from a couple of years ago, if I'm not wrong.
I think so.
Which is the same question we're asking, right? Is it going
2019? Yeah. Same question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So still asking that question. It doesn't feel like it's moving too far, but I'm glad that this question's being asked. What I think is really interesting from that article is that, it's the same thing we've been saying, Lori, is that we went through our teacher prep programs. We came out on the other end without the actual knowledge we needed to teach kids how to read.
I know.
Right. And that's not great.
Not great. And I think one of the quotes that struck me, and actually when we did that little exercise where we both pulled quotes from the article, we pulled the same quote. The author of this article in Edweek said it wasn't until her Philadelphia charter school paid for Sacchetti to earn certification through an explicit systematic phonics program that she finally understood the evidence-based strategies for teaching early reading.
Yeah. And I feel like that's really been hitting home for me recently. In Baltimore, we started the letters training. We've had Mississippi on where they're doing it. And there was this was a recent article from North Carolina, because North Carolina is, I think, the whole state maybe mandating the letters training or a similar training. But even the title of that article is this this training is now making weary teachers spend long hours learning, right? Which is in the article, they said they want to learn this, but especially this year is a tough year already. So on top of that, now you're asking me to learn even more. And my initial thought when I saw this article was why aren't we learning it when we are being trained to be a teacher? Why are we waiting until after, when teachers are teaching, to have them do this extra training when it does feel like a burden? It feels like extra, right?
Yeah, totally. I know. And it's so much to ask of teachers, especially this year, but if it was part of undergrad, I mean, it should be part of undergrad is our point, but if it were part of undergrad, then they would go in and then they'd have a foundation to build on. So, thinking about what teachers do during their teaching time, then they could be applying what they learned in undergrad, which, I mean, optimally would be the best case scenario. And then if they do choose to go on to get a master's or another certification, that could really extend or deepen the knowledge that they already have. But when they're trying to, I mean, I just think about how stressed I get when I'm trying to learn something new, and they're teaching full time in a very stressful year. I mean, not that teachers don't have unstressful years, but
That's true. But this is like
this year feels a little bit more stressful. You're trying to learn something new in that space, and it's like, are you available to learn? It's hard. Yeah. It's hard.
And like, why not learn it when you are in that space to learn, when you're going to school?
That's the
you're
purpose.
Signing up to learn. So there's actually a tweet that I came across just the other day, and I think I retweeted it from Jasmine 1980. Who's a
shout out to Jasmine 1980.
Jasmine. And she said the letters course needs to be turned into units for initial teacher education at every university. This is the depth of knowledge needed to teach reading. My recent experience confirms exactly why we are so underprepared to effectively teach reading and writing, and I'm angry. And like, you should be, right? Like
I'm also angry. I also, in the article that will the science of reading catch on in teacher prep, it goes on to share how much time and money was spent not learning how to teach reading.
Right.
That, I think, those are big buckets. Time, money, those are pretty important buckets in life. Like we need to really be shifting how collegiate spaces are teaching teachers to teach reading.
And there's a lot of teachers like Jasmine who are like, after taking a letters training or in Gillingham, these trainings that get really deep into how to teach kids how to read, who have a very similar response to someone in the article that I didn't write down who it was, but the person quoted, now I feel like I could take a student and I could teach them how to read. Whereas before I felt like I was just reading with kids. Like, that's the same, like now, like those trainings are so valuable. Why are we not giving them to every teacher and giving them that same confident feeling going into the classroom?
Exactly. Well, Hannah has a lot to say on this, and we are going to hear from her so that we can get into her article or her piece, Getting Districts and Teacher Prep on the Same Page on Reading Pays Off, and we're going to hear why it does that. You wouldn't mind just by sharing a little bit about yourself and kind of what prompted you to write this piece. And I think this will be really authentic because we didn't do a pre-call, so I actually don't know anything about you other than your email signature and what I found when when we emailed back and forth. So Hannah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Hannah Putman. I'm the Managing Director of Research at the National Council on Teacher Quality, which is a nonprofit driven by the mission that every child deserves access to effective teachers and every teacher deserves the opportunity to become effective. And we really look at the institutions that support teachers on this path. So we look at the preparation programs that teach people how to become teachers, the states and district policies that really affect people's day-to-day work, who can enter the profession, how much they get paid, how they're evaluated. And the blog post that I wrote was about a recent study coming out of the Calder Center, the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research, which does fantastic work. And they had written this really interesting study looking at the intersection of two of these institutions. So looking at the relationship between what people, and especially special education elementary teachers, are learning in their preparation program about how to teach reading, and then what their districts are expecting them to teach their special education students. Yeah. And there's not as much research on special education teachers and students in general as we would like, but especially much of the research focuses on either teacher preparation or school district practices, but so little looks at the intersection. And what they found was that not only does what people learn in each of those places matter, but it's really the way that those different institutions work together that can either have the greatest benefit for students or can actually do harm if teachers aren't teaching research-based practices.
That's really important. And thank you for calling out that research. I realize it's a pretty generous body of research. So I will link that in the show notes if anybody would like to go on and read that. I'll also link your piece. I'm just also going to name it right now. It came out on September 23rd, 2021, Getting Districts and Teacher Prep on the Same Page on Reading Pays Off. And you just did a little summary of that. And I'm curious about when you were writing this, who's your audience? Like, is your audience teachers? Is it leaders? Is it everyone in the educational field? I feel like sometimes I know, myself when I was a teacher back in the day, I didn't necessarily think of myself as someone who would be interested in, policy, which I feel like is where this really fits. But I do think that teachers are starting to rise up and be interested in policy because it does impact the classroom so much. So if you could just share a little bit about the audience, that'd be really awesome.
Sure. So this blog came out in our Teacher Quality Bulletin, which is a monthly newsletter that we put out. And while the audience is largely geared toward policymakers at the state and district level, towards teacher preparation program leaders and faculty, we also really want to make this accessible to parents, to advocates, to teachers, especially. I was a teacher myself for a few years, quite a while back. And generally, teachers don't have the time or necessarily the background in how to read the actual research studies. I mean, this paper that I wrote the blog about was a 50-some-odd page study with econometric models. It's really complicated. I don't know many teachers who are in the classroom today who have the time to read that kind of thing, right. Much as it might, help inform their practice. And so what we try to do with these blogs is really distill research down to the most salient points that we can capture in a page or so. And for teachers, I think this piece, knowing that not everybody is being taught the best way to teach reading, and not everybody's districts are expecting them to teach the best way to teach reading, is really helpful to know, because you spoke a bit to your experience before, and I've heard from so many other teachers that often they're just not taught what the research says is good reading practice. And they're never going to know that until they are taught the right way to teach. And so calling attention to that so that teachers can start to question their own practice, what they've been taught, is so important. And so while teachers are not necessarily our primary audience, I think it is a really great opportunity for them to get some insight into what researchers are saying that is just not accessible to them otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. And this is very accessible. I will say I read it, and then, you had linked the research within, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll come back to that another day when I have a little bit more time to read 50 pages here. But thank you, Hannah, for summarizing it for us. I also want to note the graph that you included in your piece, and I'd love to talk a bit about that, because I think that is really, really important. It shares the literacy practices that are used in schools, and then it talks about the disconnection between how teacher prep programs are preparing teachers. So would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. So what they did was the researchers surveyed the actual preparation programs. This is based in work in Washington State, and there are 13 preparation programs there that train aspiring special education teachers. And so they surveyed the leaders and faculty of those programs to find out what is it that they're teaching aspiring teachers about how to teach reading. And then they also surveyed the school district leaders of special education programs across the state, all the places that these aspiring teachers end up getting jobs, to find out what literacy practices are you emphasizing. And they had a few really interesting findings. First, they found that districts were not all emphasizing the practices that are considered evidence-based. So the ones that fit into what's known as the science of reading, the phonics, phonological awareness, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary. They found that when districts tended to do these practices, they tended to do all of them. They did what's called factor analysis to see which of these survey items kind of cluster together, and districts tended to do all of those or very few of them, which was very interesting. It's not like people were kind of picking and choosing. It was the districts clearly have kind of a school of thought of how they're teaching reading.
That is so interesting. Like it's like an all or nothing approach.
It was. Those of us who've kind of followed the reading wars know that there is kind of a philosophy of you do all of these, but for these researchers to independently verify not by asking about a district's kind of broader philosophy of reading, but just which specific components are you emphasizing, that in the responses they could see that that's kind of hanging together was really interesting. And then conversely, they asked about some practices that are not as based in research, and found that while those were less prevalent, there are still a fair number of districts that are practicing them, and a lot of teachers who are in districts that practice those.
Yeah.
But they also found a big disconnect between what teachers were being taught in their programs and what teachers were expected to teach in the classroom. And one of those big disconnects was around those evidence-based practices, where people were much more likely to be in a district that is expecting them to teach phonics, phonological awareness, than to have, but it was quite often that their preparation program hadn't actually taught them that. So they were going to the classroom without this information that they needed to have.
Yeah. Did it continue to share? And I will say I didn't get through the whole 50-page report. I know we were talking today and I read your piece and I read parts of that, but did it continue to share what should, like any recommendations or what could possibly positively impact this?
Yeah. So what they found, one of the really interesting findings was that, I mean, the past research shows that students learn more about how to read when their teachers are teaching these evidence-based practices. And they found that that's true when teachers were in preparation programs that taught them those practices, their students learn more about how to read, or they become stronger readers. When they're in districts that are emphasizing those practices, their students learn more. But the greatest gains were for students whose teachers were in programs that taught these practices and whose districts emphasize it. It's not surprising, but it really shows that it's not just that somebody can learn this once they enter the classroom and they're good to go, that they are really going to benefit most from kind of a systemic being taught evidence-based reading from preparation through when they're in the classroom, that they have curricular materials that are emphasizing the right way to teach reading. And so the researchers don't really get into the weeds about what that looks like, but they make reference to teacher preparation program and school district partnerships, and saying that should extend into things like curricular materials, to make sure that the materials used in the classrooms really match what the research says is effective.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I'm not sure if you've read Morgan Polikoff's book about, it's called Beyond Standards.
I have not.
Not yet. Okay.
I've heard of it.
I know we didn't talk about this, but we just spoke with him, so I think that's why it's top of mind. But he wrote a brilliant book about the educational impact of the standards and over time and what that's done to the infrastructure of education. And I think it really speaks, it intertwines with what you're talking about today. Like the teacher prep programs really do need to be in alignment with what's happening in the field. And I feel like I'd love to interview or talk to or have some insights from, a state superintendent who is looking to make the shift and like really be able to articulate that process, or even talk with some who've done it successfully. And of course, Louisiana comes to mind. But I wonder, like, what do you think, state superintendents or leaders of states who are able to be supportive of local education agencies in transitioning to high quality materials and transitioning to alignment essentially, I guess we're talking about alignment from birth to all, I guess, collegiate level, what could that look like, or what would we want them to hear or know, what, in your opinion?
Yeah, so we, National Council on Teacher Quality, actually released an action guide for states about a year ago called the 4 Pillars, where we kind of give some guidelines around what state leaders should do in terms of setting guidelines for teacher preparation programs, setting parameters for instructional materials that are used at the K-12 level to make sure they're high quality, using strong assessments. So there's very actionable steps that state leaders can take. I think one of my favorite examples, actually, in terms of looking at systems level change, comes from Mississippi, where they have taken on improving reading instruction at both teacher preparation and at K-12. And one of the big challenges is, unfortunately, not all teacher preparation program reading faculty actually know the science of reading. There's been past research that
Yeah.
I mean, if they've been trained in, the whole language approach, that's what they know. And so that's what they go on to teach. And there's been research where they actually give reading faculty tests akin to the licensure test that a teacher would take, and find that not all reading faculty actually know, the component, phonics and some of the basics that an elementary teacher needs to know.
Yeah.
And so what Mississippi did was work with preparation programs to revamp their syllabi, but also provide optional training for reading faculty. I think they used the LETRS program to make sure that they knew the science of reading. They also provided training at the K-12 level to teachers. And so they were really trying to target kind of across the board, because strong curricular materials are great, but if you have somebody using them who doesn't understand the process behind them, you're not going to get very far.
That's right. And if the person who taught the person who's using the materials doesn't understand, it's just such a domino effect. And I think that's why I appreciated your pieces, and the research that you highlighted within it, is that it's digging into the root cause and really asking the questions that we need to ask in order to get to the root of it. But I often think of this as like, it is not as easy as saying, okay, we're going to fix teacher prep programs and everything is just going to flow beautifully from there. It's really this like side-in approach that has to happen. Like like you said, teacher prep programs really need to educate their staff, and it's just so important that everyone have the knowledge that they need so they feel confident doing the job that they have to do. And that includes all kinds of teachers at the collegiate level, at the elementary level, at the middle and high school level, and what that looks like. It would be really exciting to think about this as like an overhaul of the educational system, the impetus for that overhaul. I feel like we're at a really important point in time in education right now.
Yeah, and I do think that we are, as you say, we are at an inflection point where a lot of people have been trained in kind of old, debunked ways of teaching, but we are seeing real progress. We've seen many more preparation programs teaching scientifically based reading instruction, but still a ways to go. We still have half of programs when my organizations last looked at them that are still not teaching even 4 out of the 5 components of reading. So there's a ways to go, but we are seeing progress. But one of the biggest challenges is there's this other kind of school of thought of how to teach reading called balanced literacy, which is seen as kind of the middle ground between whole language and scientifically based reading instruction. It's supposed to be the best of both worlds.
Sure.
And one of the findings from this study in Washington State actually found that districts that emphasize balanced literacy, their students learn less. Like it is doing harm. They saw about 5% of a standard deviation less growth in reading for those students. So this idea that many teachers espouse to, many preparation program faculty teach of like, we're going to teach it all, and the more approaches, more methods is better, is not the case, and it's actually making it harder for students to learn to read. So I think we are at an inflection point, but there's some strongholds out there that are hard to move.
That's true. And could you just name what encompasses balanced literacy? And I think for listeners, it might be helpful to name things like I'm thinking about like workshop models and things like that are just that it's considered this balance scale approach versus going deep into phonics, going deep into knowledge building. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. Sure.
So I was trying to find a good definition of balanced literacy, and it was kind of all over the place. It's kind of, it seems like it's, in the eye of the beholder. So when people talk about scientifically based reading instruction or evidence-based reading, there are 5 core components that you're teaching: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension, and not just that you're teaching each of these things in isolation. There's supposed to be a systemic, sequential kind of approach to teach all of these things. whole language, on the other hand, is more of this idea that students are just going to kind of absorb reading, which, I mean, honestly, like that's how my parents read to me a lot. I picked up on it easily. Like, I don't remember getting clear-cut phonics instruction. I remember just kind of picking up on how to read. And the idea is lots of kids can pick up on reading that way, but that's just not how it happens. And then
can I make a quick note? There's a documentary coming out called The Truth About Reading. Have you heard of it?
I have not. No.
Okay, I'll send you the trailer after this. We interviewed their documentary team, and then they sent us the trailer when it came out. And to that point of what you just said, like, lots of kids learn that way. Some kids do learn that way, and you're right. But what the moment in the trailer that struck me and spoke to what you just mentioned is, and one of the experts that they interviewed said it would be like having a child listen to Mozart and playing Mozart for years and having the child listen to it, and then sitting the child at a piano and saying, okay, now you play. Like, that is what we're asking students to do. And while some may be able to strike some notes, many are unable to learn that way. So I just wanted to interject that, like, really tangible example for people listening.
That is a great analogy. And research bears that out, that there are a portion of students who will just kind of pick up on reading. But the thing is, many students without this systemic explicit instruction will not. But with appropriate reading instruction, we can go from right now only, a third of students who are reading proficiently. The reading gap can close substantially, that we can get down to fewer than 1 in 10 students not being able to read on grade level just by using appropriate instruction. So rather than relying on this approach that, works for some kids and is maybe fun because you read a lot of stories, that appropriate reading instructions really gets nearly every child on grade level so that every child can engage in reading on their own, which is the goal. And balanced literacy is supposed to be this blend of both. One of the features of it that people talk a lot about is the 3 cueing system, where if you don't know a word, there's supposed to be a few different strategies that you can try, including looking at the pictures around the word or guessing the word with context clues. And I was watching, you probably saw one of Emily Hanford's documentaries that came out a few months ago. She interviewed 2 students, one of whom had been taught scientifically based reading instruction, one of whom had been taught balanced literacy. And she asked the 2 kids, if you come to a word you don't know, what do you do? And one of the kids said, well, I sound it out. Like, I look at the letters, I figure out what sounds they make, and I sound out the word. And the other kid says, oh, I look at the pictures and I guess. That kid is not going to learn how to read. What does she do when she gets to a textbook that only has 1 picture on every page and it doesn't tell you all the words? So,
which is literally the majority of books that you read in your life, or need to read.
So these strategies, like, they are kind of coping mechanisms that end up replacing the hard work that students need to do to get to the point of being able to read fluently. Whereas instead, what you should be doing is learning how to sound out the words. That process kind of helps the words become almost like muscle memory. And so you don't, once you've seen the word a dozen times, you're not sounding it out every time. You know the word, but simply seeing the word and guessing what it is based on a picture, you're not making that muscle memory. And so this, by teaching these coping mechanisms, you're helping students avoid doing the hard work that actually makes them stronger readers.
Yeah, the hard work that their brain needs to do. Like, it's like weightlifting, right? Their brain needs to have, do that work so that they can grow stronger. That's a really great way to put it. Thank you for that. We always ask our guests, and I did not preview this for you, but I have a feeling that you will be just fine. We always ask our guests to leave our listeners with a piece of advice. And so I'm curious if you could just think about teachers and leaders listening to this podcast and share with them a piece of advice that you'd like them to have after considering this piece that we just talked about and the research that holds it strong.
Yeah. So when thinking about reading instruction, I think the greatest challenge for teachers is that many people just don't know what they don't know. I think when you go into the classroom, especially if you've been taught an approach that is, you've been taught it by your preparation program. You assume that they know what they're talking about. You may not realize that there's this whole other way of teaching reading that you've just never been introduced to. And it sounds like just so many teachers have that experience. So I would say, if as you're listening to this or doing other reading, if it seems like you are in that position of there is this whole way of teaching reading that you were just never taught, seek out the resources to help you learn how to do it, because for your students, that's what they need. They need strong reading instruction. They need teachers who know it. And it's not teachers' fault that they weren't taught it. It's a breakdown in the system. But it's never too late to learn what you don't know yet.
I love that. Thank you, Hannah. And Hannah, thank you so much for joining me and for engaging in this conversation around this beautiful piece that you wrote. And we will link your piece. We'll link the research for anyone who has time to read it or who would like to learn more. And we'll also link that action guide that you mentioned. Thank you for that.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and for all the great work that you're doing. This is really exciting.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good day, Hannah.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening, literacy lovers. Be sure to visit our website to subscribe to our newsletter and podcast. It's literacypodcast.com.
Yep. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Most of them are at Literacy Podcast.
Yes. And please, please, please reach out to us. Melissa, what's our email address?
Melissa and Lori at literacypodcast.com is our email address. And we love getting emails from you all. And Lori and I
really read them.
Yeah,
and we really respond.
We love when you all reach out and we get to have conversations with you. So please email us.
Let us know what you're thinking, what you're thinking about literacy, what you're thinking about
ideas for us to podcast about.
Yes, ideas for podcasting, anything. We love to hear from you, what you liked, what you want.
Yeah,
we're here for you.
Mostly y'all are asking questions, which is great.
Yes.
We don't mind that either.
Yes. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.
Thank you, everybody.